Hi, I'm Hannah Simonson. I'm an architectural historian and cultural resources planner at Page & Turnbull here in San Francisco. I'm also the current president of the Northern California chapter of Docomomo US, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates for the preservation of modern architecture. It's an international organization. And through that group and some other work that I've done here in San Francisco, I gave a tour for the Cultural Landscape Foundation a few years ago of the Embarcadero Plaza and Embarcadero Center. And we're going to be visiting those sites along with a couple of other sites of public space in San Francisco today. And I'm excited to share these really cool spaces with you. So we're here at Embarcadero Plaza in San Francisco. This plaza used to be known as Justin Herman Plaza. We're right on the waterfront, and as you can see, we're right near the ferry building, which is an iconic San Francisco landmark, probably one of the spots that every tourist and visitor and resident has seen before. We're right at the end of Market Street, which is kind of the main commercial thoroughfare through San Francisco. So this is really at the heart of San Francisco's kind of commercial core here. And this plaza was designed by landscape architect Lawrence Halpern, completed in 1972. This was part of a much larger project, the Market Street redevelopment plan, which spanned several miles of Market Street, included the redesign of the street itself after the BART public transit system was installed, and included several other plazas like UN Plaza and Halliday Plaza. Halpern worked with a couple of other architects on that project, including John Bowles and John Warnicki and Mario Ciampi. So that was a massive undertaking, and that project kind of terminates in this plaza here next to the water. You can see this is a very open space, very modernist in design, kind of a modernist take on an Italian piazza. The main focal feature, of course, is the fountain, Valancourt Fountain, designed by a sculptor, Armand Valancourt. And this fountain is kind of an interesting remnant of an earlier history in San Francisco. There used to be a double-decker freeway behind us along the Embarcadero. Some people may remember that. But the idea behind the fountain was to kind of bring a more humane scale to the plaza, but also to kind of riff off the concrete monster of the freeway behind it. So there was this sense of water coming out of the fountain and also cars whizzing by. So that created kind of a dramatic effect. It's a bit of a contentious sculpture. You either love it or you hate it. I love it. Halpern loved it as well. He was quoted as saying something to the effect of, if this fountain wasn't one of the great works of civic art, he would slit his throat. A little bit dramatic, but clearly he stood by this design. And I have another quote from, I think it was a newspaper article from the time of construction that described the fountain as, wheezing vehicles on the freeway seem to weave through the concrete sculpture, giving it a kinetic urban essence, and at the same time, embracing and adding dimension to the freeway. So I think that's kind of a poetic way of summing up the kind of design intention of this fountain. So I'm glad it's still here, and I'm glad the water is pouring out today. The plaza itself, I mentioned it's a very open space. It is a public park, so maintained by Rec and Park here, and it's used for all kinds of different events, concerts, public gatherings. Historically, it was a very iconic skateboarding site. You may have seen it in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Nowadays, the skateboarders tend to be further out on the Embarcadero. But this was a very intentional kind of move on Halpern's part. He said of the design that the plaza was conceived as a total environment in which all elements working together create a place for participation. So he's really interested in this being a true public space, a place where people can come together, and the sort of open, unprogrammed nature of it facilitates many, many different kinds of uses over time. So now we're looking down on Embarcadero Plaza, which was designed by landscape architect Lawrence Halpern. If people haven't heard Lawrence Halpern's name, if you've lived in San Francisco, you most certainly have interacted with landscapes designed by Lawrence Halpern. He's really one of the preeminent figures in modern landscape design. He was born in New York City and attended Cornell University and the University of Wisconsin, as well as Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He then apprenticed with landscape architect Thomas Church here in San Francisco. Thomas Church also was kind of one of the founding fathers of modernist landscape design, also based in San Francisco. And after working with Church, one of the kind of most important examples of the new California modern landscape design was the Donnell Garden up in Sonoma County, a beautiful private landscape with a kind of kidney bean shaped pool overlooking the coast. And then in the 40s, he went on to found his own practice here in San Francisco. And it was a really interesting time for landscape architecture in the Bay Area and throughout the country. There's a lot of new construction and redevelopment happening in San Francisco. So Lawrence Halpern is responsible for a number of really important and wonderful projects around San Francisco that you may have visited yourself, including Ghirardelli Square, as well as several other plazas along Market Street, including UN Plaza by the Civic Center and Halliday Plaza, also on Market Street. Other really prominent examples of Halpern's work in San Francisco include Levi's Plaza, which was completed in the 80s, so a little bit later. And outside the Bay Area, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial is probably one of his most prominent works. So there's a lot of fun trivia related to Embarcadero Plaza. Probably my favorite tidbit of trivia is the action movie Bullitt has a wonderful scene where the main character is visiting his kind of girlfriend or love interest, and she is a landscape architect. And she actually is filmed in Lawrence Halpern's office, which the building they shared with Worcester, Bernardi, and Emmons. And so you can see examples of Halpern's work on the walls. And she's there actually calculating diameters for some pipes for a fountain. And it's pretty clear based on the timeline and what else is going in the office that she is calculating diameter for the fountain right here in Embarcadero Plaza, which I think is really cool. Embarcadero Plaza has also been the site of many interesting and important events, including Occupy Wall Street, and an even earlier example, U2 had a free concert in the 80s as part of their Joshua Tree tour, and during that concert, Bono spray painted live in front of everyone, "Rock and roll stops the traffic" on the side of the fountain here, much to Dianne Feinstein's chagrin. She apparently was part of an anti-graffiti task force at the time and took him to task for that, and I think he had to publicly apologize for the graffiti. So we've now moved to the Embarcadero Center, which is a very large office and hotel and retail complex in San Francisco. Right now we're standing in what is called a privately owned public open space, or POPOS as we call them in San Francisco. The complex was designed by architect John Portman, and it was built over basically a decade. Construction started in 1971 and finished in 1981, with the whole complex being kind of opened with an opening celebration in 1982. So we're standing at Embarcadero Center 4, which was the last building to be completed. And we're standing just in front of the Tulip, which is a piece of sculpture and public art that John Portman actually designed himself for this space. John Portman was born in 1924 and died in 2017. He was a really prolific Atlanta-based architect and developer. He also had a quite an interest in art and sculpture, and so he did a number of artistic pieces on his own as well. He really is known for his hotel designs. These very expansive atrium lobbies were kind of a feature of his hotel design, and he really kind of made that a staple. He worked on this project with a series of other developers, including David Rockefeller and Trammell Crow. David Rockefeller, of course, of the Rockefeller family in New York City, and Trammell Crow of Texas. And this project, when it was first revealed in the late 60s, proposed to the city of San Francisco, there were a lot of people who kind of started calling it Rockefeller Center West, referencing Rockefeller Center in New York City. But the design team really had a massive PR campaign to get people to just call it Embarcadero Center, because they didn't really want the association with Manhattan or New York City, because at the time in San Francisco, there was a lot of concern about how quickly downtown was being developed and all these new high-rises that were going in. And San Franciscans were concerned that San Francisco might lose some of its character, become too much like Manhattan. So there was this sort of anti-Manhattanization sentiment that was building during the late 60s and into the early 70s. And part of the argument that Portman made for how this complex gives back to the city and the citizens here is the extensive privately owned public open space. So essentially, this office center has 4 blocks of open plazas at the top, as well as a network of stairs and bridges and different levels of retail below. So it's a really kind of intricate network of open space and retail environment that anyone can partake in. John Portman was definitely interested in how people move through 3-dimensional space and kind of making that an event. If you've been to any of John Portman's hotels, you'll know that almost always in the atrium lobby, there are glass elevators that run up along the side of the atrium. So you're kind of looking down into the lobby. It's very dramatic. Here in the Embarcadero Center, there are lots of escalators that move you through these different levels of retail space. And I think this experience also is just really wonderful, like bringing you up through the different levels of the retail, up here to the top of the plaza, up into the air. All right, so we're standing on one of several pedestrian bridges that are part of the Embarcadero Center. And these bridges span over public streets. So we're standing over a street right now. This creates a really kind of cohesive environment here. The idea is that pedestrians don't have to walk at the street level and, wait for traffic lights. You can walk from beginning to end of the Embarcadero Center in just a few minutes using the bridges and stairs. So now we're in the middle of the Embarcadero Center between Embarcadero 1 and 2, and we're looking back again at the ferry building. There was a lot of concern from the community about the height of these towers and whether or not having 4 of them in a row would create kind of a visual barrier between the northern kind of more residential area of Telegraph Hill and North Beach and the downtown financial district. However, Portman was very intentional in his design with how the buildings are arranged on the block. So he was really prioritizing the views to the waterfront and the ferry building when kind of siting these buildings. All right, so we're standing on a pedestrian bridge that connects the Embarcadero Center to Maritime Plaza. This was a project that was part of the Golden Gateway redevelopment area, as was the Embarcadero Center. This is an earlier designed building. The tower itself was designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Worcester, Bernardi, and Emmons designed the base. And an interesting note is that the base of Maritime Plaza, there's a park on the top, and then the base is a kind of concrete facade around a parking garage. So it's very stark kind of pedestrian experience at the street level around that building. And Portman pretty explicitly stated that he wanted the Embarcadero Center to be more porous and more welcoming at the street level, which is kind of learning from, I think, some of the earlier examples of commercial buildings in the area. And it's also kind of interesting to note that Portman had to kind of respond to and work within kind of this overall Golden Gateway redevelopment master planned area, and there's certain buildings and parks that already existed. One of the conditions of approval for the Embarcadero Center was that the developer team would spend 1% of the total construction costs on public art. And this was a kind of interesting decision that was made because in the 1985 downtown plan, this actually became kind of a matter of course. So it was a program that was implemented for downtown construction. But at the time of the Embarcadero Center, this was kind of an arrangement that was made with the developers of the Embarcadero Center, with the redevelopment agency and the board of supervisors. And actually the developer team spent, by some accounts, nearly $5 million on public art, which was well over the kind of minimum 1% threshold. So this included 4 very large pieces of sculpture, like the one we see here. So there was one at each office tower building. There's also some sculpture inside the Hyatt Regency lobby. There's a number of other smaller sculptures kind of scattered throughout the Embarcadero Center. And originally, there were also some really amazing, very large-scale textile works, some of which were like 3 stories tall. I wanted to stop and talk about this sculpture specifically. Other than the tulip, this is probably my favorite piece of public art that's still at the Embarcadero Center. This sculpture is called 2 Columns with Wedge, built in 1971 by a Swiss artist, Willy Gutmann. It's an 82-foot tall, 17-ton stainless steel sculpture. And an interesting fact is that it was fabricated by a San Francisco walk manufacturing company, Robert Yick & Co. So in the 1980s, as soon as the Embarcadero Center was completed, Portman announced that there was a plan for an expansion of the Embarcadero Center, known as Embarcadero West. And that includes another hotel building that's just near here, as well as an extension of this pedestrian promenade and the renovation of the Federal Building, which is behind me. It's now the early 80s, and Portman has kind of started experimenting with a more postmodern architectural style, whereas the Embarcadero Center is very much in this kind of corporate modern, late modern design. This is a more kind of fun and whimsical kind of postmodern approach, playing off the classical architecture of the Federal Building. But the whole complex is still tied together with these concentric circle tile paving at the pedestrian level. This paving kind of gives a cohesive aesthetic throughout the entire Embarcadero Center. And here we're standing at kind of the very edge, leading out of Embarcadero Center and Embarcadero Center West. And I'll steal a little tidbit from John here. He likes to call this the choose your own adventure of architecture. As I mentioned before, Portman he had kind of a playful attitude towards movement through 3-dimensional space. And here you can see there's several different ways that you can leave this pedestrian plaza level and go down to the street. So there's this spiral staircase, or another set of stairs that leads to this dramatic kind of sloping stairway beneath the colonnades. You have different options for how to move through the space, and perhaps it's not the most efficient, but it is very fun and whimsical. All right, we're now in Transamerica Redwood Park. We're here at the foot of the Transamerica Pyramid, probably one of the most iconic buildings in San Francisco. It also was one of the most contentious buildings when it was proposed and constructed. And when this building was proposed, people were really concerned about how the building related to the adjacent neighborhoods and whether or not it was too tall for the city of San Francisco. The pyramid was approved slightly shorter than William Pereira, the architect's initial proposal. And also part of the conversation when Transamerica Pyramid was being proposed, Transamerica Corporation decided that they would utilize this extra space next to the Transamerica Pyramid to create a publicly accessible park area. And they kind of marketed this as giving back to the city of San Francisco. So rather than having it be strictly private space only for their office tenants, this was meant to be a publicly accessible space. The park was designed by landscape architect Anthony Gazzardo, and the park was completed in 1973. So it predates the 1985 downtown plan, which officially codified the privately owned public open space, or POPOS, program in San Francisco. But this park is really meant to feel like a park, much more vegetated and lush. You can see that this is a really good example of kind of like California modernist landscape design. The redwood trees and the fountain behind me are kind of meant to respond to the height and shape of the Transamerica Pyramid behind and bring some of that California nature into the park. And I think this is an interesting point of contrast to Embarcadero Center, which also has a lot of publicly accessible but privately owned space within the complex. But the approach is much more to create this kind of city within a city, sort of a street-like experience, but a more interior experience. So rather than storefronts along the street, you're kind of entering into the complex and moving through a retail environment that's sort of semi-outdoors, semi-private, semi-public. But these kind of examples of publicly accessible space in these large commercial developments really spoke to San Franciscans, and they really felt like they did deserve some kind of space or givebacks from these commercial developments. And that was kind of what led to the inclusion of like a formal program for POPOS in the 1985 downtown plan. So now all large commercial developments within the downtown area of San Francisco are required to provide these POPOS, which can be sort of parks or plazas, somewhat like the one that we're standing in, or they can be rooftop gardens. There's a number of different kind of forms that POPOS take today, and there's many great examples throughout downtown that you should definitely check out.